Your hands, that was wrong." And after that, the rancher faced something terrifying. The sun had barely started rising over the wide, open fields when the rancher stepped out of his small wooden house. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh grass and earth. He pulled on his worn boots and ran a hand over the fence posts, feeling the rough texture beneath his fingers. The ranch had been in his family for generations, and though much of it had changed with time, the land still held the memories of those who had worked it before him. Every hill, every bend in the stream, every old oak tree told a story, and he felt a deep connection to all of it. He began his day as he always did, walking slowly along the line of cattle in the pasture. They looked up at him with calm eyes, recognizing the gentle authority he carried. For him, this was more than work. It was a rhythm of life. Each cow he fed, each gate he closed, each fence he mended, was part of a routine that made him feel steady and grounded. He liked the quiet, the way the world seemed to pause here in the open land. He liked the way the wind rustled through the grass, carrying soft whispers that made him feel alive. But there was also a loneliness that came with this life. The rancher had chosen it, and he loved it, but sometimes he wondered if he had chosen it too strictly, too carefully, leaving little room for companionship. His family had long since moved away, seeking lives in the town, and the neighbors were few and far between. Most days, his only company was the animals and the occasional bird that visited the yard. On nights when the stars blanketed the sky, he sometimes thought about how vast and quiet the world could feel when it was just him and the land. Still, he never let that quiet discourage him. He moved from task to task with purpose. Today, he needed to check the fence along the northern pasture. It had been weakened in places by the winter storms, and a loose post could mean disaster if cattle wandered out. As he walked, he noticed tracks in the mud near the edge of the property. They were deeper than animal prints, larger than deer or foxes. The rancher paused, squinting, trying to make sense of them. He had learned to read the land like a book. Each mark had meaning. But these tracks were strange, almost human, yet he could not tell for sure. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. Perhaps it was just a neighbor passing by, or a trick of the soft earth after the rain. By mid-morning, he was repairing a gate that had swung loose. Hammering the nails with steady rhythm, he felt the satisfaction of work being done right. The sun climbed higher, turning the fields golden and making the sweat on his back glisten. He paused briefly, wiping his brow, and looked across the pasture. The cattle were grazing quietly, but one of the calves seemed restless, nudging its mother repeatedly. He frowned slightly, wondering if it was ill or simply impatient. He approached slowly, keeping calm, and after a moment the calf settled. There was comfort in these small victories, moments that reminded him that despite all the challenges, he could manage the land and its creatures. Lunch was simple, a sandwich and water, eaten on the porch as the wind carried the faint scent of pine from the nearby hills. He watched a hawk circle above, its shadow gliding over the fields, and felt a sense of peace. Yet even in these calm moments, a subtle unease lingered. There was a sound earlier, a soft rustling from the edge of the woods that he could not place. Perhaps it was just the wind, but the feeling stayed with him, a quiet whisper that something was not quite right. After lunch, he saddled his horse and rode along the farthest pasture. He liked riding alone, letting his thoughts wander while keeping an eye on the fences and cattle. The horse moved steadily beneath him, muscles rippling, hooves sinking slightly into the soft earth. They followed the creek that marked the edge of the ranch, the water sparkling in the sunlight, birds darting over it in quick flashes. He enjoyed these moments, the silence, broken only by the gentle clop of hooves and the occasional splash of the creek against the rocks. As he rounded a bend near the northern fence, he noticed the tracks again, more pronounced this time. They led toward the old barn at the far end of the property. He frowned, gripping the reins tighter. There was no sign of anyone or anything now, just the prints in the soft dirt. A cold shiver ran down his spine. He tried to shake it off. Maybe a traveler had passed through or a lost hiker, nothing more. Yet the thought lingered, nagging at the back of his mind. By late afternoon, the rancher returned to the barn to check on the tools and feed the animals kept inside. The barn smelled of hay, leather, and earth, familiar and comforting. As he moved through it, he felt the rhythm of his work, stacking hay, checking water troughs, oiling tools. But then a small detail caught his eye. One of the tools he had left neatly on the shelf yesterday was on the floor. He frowned. He was careful, methodical. Things rarely went missing, and if he misplaced something, he would know it instantly. Yet here it was on the ground as if someone had moved it. He paused, scanning the barn. Empty. Silent. He shook his head again, trying not to give in to the unease. Perhaps the wind had knocked it over. Evening came and the sky turned shades of pink and orange. The rancher stood outside, watching the sunset paint the horizon. The cattle were settling down, the air cooling and the land quieting for the night. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, having accomplished his daily tasks, yet a small, uncomfortable feeling remained. There was something about today, something he could not explain. As darkness fell, he lit a lantern in the barn and checked the animals one last time. The night was still, but faint sounds carried through the air. The rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, and something else, something that made him pause. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, like footsteps in the distance. He listened, heart beating a little faster, but heard nothing more. He shook his head and muttered to himself, "Just the wind, always the wind." He returned to the house, locking the doors carefully. Sitting by the window, he sipped water and looked out over the land bathed in moonlight. The ranch was peaceful, yet the earlier signs, the tracks, the misplaced tool, the strange feeling, remained in his mind. He could not shake the sense that something unseen had passed near him today, something he did not fully understand. That night, as he lay in bed, he heard it again, a soft rustling outside the window, followed by silence. His eyes stayed open, watching the shadows that moved with the moonlight. He thought about the day, about the work done and the peace earned, but he could not ignore the chill in his spine. Somewhere on his land, perhaps close, perhaps far, something or someone had been there. And though he could not see it clearly, he felt its presence, lingering quietly in the corners of his mind. Sleep eventually came, though uneasy and light. And as the rancher drifted off, the wind whispered through the trees once more, carrying a quiet warning he could not yet understand. The land was calm, the cattle sleeping, and the stars shining high above. But deep in the heart of the ranch, a subtle tension waited, unseen, preparing for the days to come. The next morning, the rancher woke to another clear, crisp dawn. The sky was pale blue, the horizon glowing faintly with the promise of sunlight. He stretched, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside, feeling the familiar chill of the morning air. He went about his usual routine, checking the cattle and inspecting the fences. Yet even as he moved through his work, he could not shake the unease that had settled in his chest the night before. The tracks, the strange noises, and the misplaced tool, all of it lingered in his mind like shadows that refused to leave. As he repaired a section of fence near the edge of the northern pasture, a sound made him freeze. It was soft at first, a shuffle of hooves on dirt, and then he realized it was more distinct, closer than any wild animal. He squinted into the distance and saw movement by the tree line. A figure was approaching, someone he had not expected. It was a woman riding a tired-looking horse. She waved quickly as she drew near, her face carrying both relief and hesitation. She looked around nervously as if she feared she might be watched. The rancher straightened, cautious. Visitors were rare on his land, and he had learned to trust his instincts. "Good morning," she called, her voice calm but tinged with worry. "I'm sorry to bother you, but my horse, he got injured near your property. I was hoping you might help me." The rancher studied her carefully. She seemed genuine, not threatening. Her horse had a limp, one of the back legs dragging slightly as she guided it closer. He nodded slowly, his mind calculating the risks. "I can take a look," he said finally. "Let's get him into the barn. You can stay with me while I check the injury." As they led the horse toward the barn, the woman glanced around nervously, eyes flicking to the trees and then to the barn doors. There was a strange tension about her, something he could not immediately place. When they reached the barn, he guided the horse inside, securing it carefully while he examined the leg. It was a minor injury, likely a bruise from stepping on a sharp rock, but the horse was clearly uncomfortable. While tending to the animal, the woman spoke softly, almost hesitantly. I don't know why, but something felt wrong when I came here," she said, glancing at the rancher. "Maybe it's just me, but—" She hesitated, looking at her hands, then back at him. "Your hands, that was wrong." The rancher paused, confusion flickering across his face. "Excuse me?" he asked, uncertain if he had heard correctly. I don't know how to explain it," she said, shaking her head. "It's just a feeling I had. Please don't take it the wrong way." He nodded slowly, trying to hide his unease. Strange words like that had a way of sticking, and he could feel a chill creep down his spine. He returned to checking the horse, focusing on the leg, but the woman's words echoed in his mind. Something about them felt significant, though he could not say why. After he finished tending to the horse, the woman thanked him and prepared to leave. She seemed calmer now, her earlier tension softened. "I'll make sure he rests," she said, stroking the horse gently. "Thank you again, you've been very kind." The rancher nodded, still unsettled. He watched her ride away, the horse moving slowly but steadily along the trail. Once she disappeared into the distance, he shook his head and returned to the barn, trying to convince himself it was just an odd encounter, nothing more. But even as he worked, he noticed small changes in the barn that made him pause. A bucket he had set neatly against the wall yesterday was now tipped over. A rope lay on the ground in a place he didn't remember leaving it. At first, he blamed himself. Perhaps he had been distracted, but a nagging thought told him otherwise. He moved carefully around the barn, checking the doors and windows. Everything was locked. Nothing else had been disturbed. He stepped outside, letting the sunlight warm his back, and tried to focus on routine tasks. He repaired a section of the fence, fed the animals, and organized the tools. Yet the feeling of being watched refused to leave. The land, which usually gave him comfort, now seemed different, almost alive with quiet energy he could not name. That evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple, the rancher went for a ride to clear his mind. The northern pasture was calm, the cattle grazing quietly, the wind gentle against his face. But when he reached the far edge of the property, he froze. The tracks he had noticed earlier were there again, deeper and more defined this time, leading toward the barn. It was impossible that anyone had passed without him seeing. A shiver ran down his spine. He slowed his horse, scanning the area carefully. The shadows between the trees seemed darker, almost moving on their own. He told himself it was his imagination, the stress of the day catching up. Yet the tracks were real, and he could not ignore them. He made a mental note to check the cameras he had recently set up around the property, a precaution for just such unusual events. Back at the barn, he found more signs that made his heart race. A gate that had been closed was slightly ajar. One of the feeding troughs had water splashed out, though no animal could have done it alone. He checked every corner, every tool, every rope. Nothing was missing, but the feeling of intrusion was undeniable. The rancher spent the night in the house, keeping a lantern close by and checking the doors repeatedly. He thought about the woman's words, "Your hands, that was wrong," and wondered if they had a deeper meaning. Could she have sensed something he himself did not understand? He shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. Perhaps it was coincidence, perhaps an overactive imagination, but the unease refused to fade. The next few days passed in a blur of routine and subtle strangeness. The woman did not return, but the sense of being watched persisted. Objects in the barn seemed slightly out of place, shadows moved oddly at night, and the cattle were more restless than usual. He spoke to no one about it, not even the neighbors. He preferred to handle things on his own, but the tension was growing heavier with each passing day. One evening, he rode along the creek near the northern edge of the property, hoping the familiar sights and sounds would calm him. The water sparkled in the fading sunlight, and birds darted across the surface, but even here he could not escape the feeling of eyes upon him. He scanned the trees, every shadow and shape, but saw nothing. Still, the unease remained, a weight pressing on his chest. As night fell, he returned to the house, locking doors and windows carefully. Sitting by the window with a cup of tea, he tried to focus on the calmness of the ranch. The moon rose over the hills, casting silver light across the pasture. The cattle slept quietly, and for a moment he allowed himself to breathe. But then a faint sound reached his ears, a soft shuffle near the barn. It was almost imperceptible, like the gentle brushing of feet across dirt. He froze, straining to listen. Silence returned, but the rancher knew he had heard something. His pulse quickened. Something was there, though invisible. He could not explain it, could not name it. He decided to investigate carefully. Lantern in hand, he moved toward the barn, every step deliberate. The night was cool and still, the only sounds his own breathing and the occasional rustle of leaves. When he reached the barn, everything appeared normal. The tools were in place, the gates secure, the animals calm. Yet a sense of being observed lingered, a tension in the air that he could not shake. Returning to the house, he resolved to keep watch in the coming days. Something had shifted on the ranch, something subtle but unmistakable. The visitor's words echoed in his mind, haunting and cryptic. "Your hands, that was wrong." He could not understand what she meant, but he knew deep down that it mattered. And so the rancher's life continued, work, care, and vigilance, but now with a new layer of unease. The familiar rhythms of the ranch were tinged with uncertainty, each sound and shadow carrying the weight of the unknown. He knew that something had entered his world, something that would not leave quietly. And though he did not yet know what it was, he felt its presence, silent but undeniable, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The days after the woman's visit passed slowly, but the unease that had settled over the rancher did not fade. Each morning, he walked the fields with careful eyes, inspecting fences, checking the cattle, and scanning the edges of the property for anything unusual. Yet, every day brought small reminders that something was wrong. A tool left slightly out of place, an unfamiliar footprint near the barn, a sudden movement in the shadows that seemed just beyond the reach of his lantern's light. He could not explain it, and the rational part of his mind tried to dismiss it, but the tension was growing heavier with every passing hour. One afternoon, as he rode toward the far pasture on his horse, he noticed the tracks again. They were clearer now, almost as if someone had walked deliberately along the same path he had checked just hours before. He dismounted, leaning on his horse's neck as he examined the marks. They were human, he realized, large and heavy, but he had seen no one. The idea that someone had entered his land unnoticed made his stomach tighten. He knew the ranch was isolated, far from neighbors, and yet the tracks told a story that could not be ignored. He returned to the barn, determined to check every tool, gate, and corner. But the feeling of being watched did not leave him. Shadows seemed darker, longer than they should be, and the silence of the ranch at night had begun to feel unnatural, heavy with anticipation. As he worked, his mind wandered back to the woman's words. "Your hands, that was wrong." They had seemed odd when she first said them, but now, in light of the growing strangeness around him, they felt like a warning. He did not understand them, but he could feel their weight pressing on him, like a memory of something he could not forget. That night, he set up the lanterns more carefully and checked the locks on every door. The wind blew softly through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth, and the ranch seemed quiet, almost too quiet. But as he was about to settle down, a sudden sound made him freeze. Footsteps, soft but deliberate, came from the northern edge of the property near the barn. He held his breath, listening. The sound stopped, then started again, moving closer. He grabbed a lantern and cautiously approached the barn, heart racing. As he reached the edge of the structure, he saw it, something he could not explain. A shadow moved with a strange fluidity, too large and too deliberate to be an animal. It lingered near the corner of the barn, and for a moment it seemed almost human. But the way it moved was unnatural, jerky in some moments, flowing in others. The rancher felt his chest tighten. He had faced storms, wild animals, and accidents on the ranch, but never anything like this. He called out, voice steady but tense. "Who's there?" The shadow did not respond. It simply shifted slightly, as if acknowledging him without fear. The rancher took a step closer, lantern raised. The figure retreated slightly, keeping its distance but remaining visible. His mind raced. Could this be someone playing a cruel trick, an intruder with knowledge of the land? He knew the ranch was isolated, but the movements were too deliberate to be random. Flashbacks hit him suddenly. Years ago, he had tried to help a neighbor who was in trouble, someone who had been injured in an accident. He had acted quickly, but his actions had unintentionally made things worse. The memory of that day, of the guilt he had carried silently for years, surged up inside him. He realized with a sinking feeling that the woman's words might not have been about him personally, but about that incident, the mistake he had tried to bury. And now, somehow, the land, the shadow, or whatever presence haunted him seemed to be tied to that guilt. The shadow moved closer, and with it, the sense of tension in the air thickened. The cattle in the nearby field stirred nervously, lowing softly, as if sensing the disturbance. Tools in the barn rattled, not by wind, but by something unseen. He felt fear, but also a strange clarity. Whatever this was, it was connected to his past, to the wrong he had done, to the guilt he had carried silently. He knew he could not run. The shadow or the presence would follow. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his mind. He had faced danger before, though never like this, and he understood that this confrontation was not about strength or skill. It was about facing the truth he had avoided for so long. Over the next few nights, the events escalated. The shadow appeared more often, sometimes at the edge of the fields, sometimes near the barn, always just beyond clear view. Objects moved slightly on their own, gates opened without explanation, and the animals became restless. The rancher kept careful notes, trying to find patterns, trying to understand what was happening. Each encounter left him more exhausted, more aware that he was dealing with something beyond the ordinary. Then, one evening, the shadow revealed itself more fully. It stood near the barn, tall and still, and the rancher could see the outline more clearly. Though it resembled a person in form, there was an unnatural quality to its posture, the way it held itself, the way it moved. It was as if it were more than human, a reflection of something internal, something tied to memory, regret, and conscience. The rancher approached slowly, lantern held high. "I don't know what you want," he said, voice steady but echoing in the quiet night. "I have done wrong, yes, in the past, I know it. I have carried it with me, but I cannot understand why you are here now." The shadow did not respond with words. Its presence was silent, yet the weight of its gaze felt suffocating. The rancher realized then that this was not merely a physical confrontation. This was a confrontation of conscience, of guilt, of the part of him he had tried to hide. The fear he felt was real, but it was rooted in the knowledge that he could not escape his own actions. He stood there, breathing deeply, letting the fear wash over him but not consume him. Slowly, he began to speak aloud, recounting the incident from years ago, admitting his mistake fully, acknowledging the harm he had caused. His voice was steady now, calm and clear, as if speaking aloud would release the tension he had carried for so long. The shadow shifted slightly, as if listening. The rancher continued, admitting not just the mistake itself, but the guilt he had carried, the regrets, and the fear of being found out or judged. Each word felt heavier but also lighter, as though speaking it aloud was a form of release. For a long moment there was only silence. The shadow remained, still and quiet. Then, almost imperceptibly, it seemed to recede, blending with the darkness around the barn. The tension that had gripped the air for days began to ease, leaving a calm that felt almost unnatural after so many nights of fear. The rancher stayed near the barn for a while longer, watching the stars and listening to the wind. The land was quiet, the cattle calm, and the tools remained where he had left them. The presence had not disappeared completely. He could feel it, faint and distant, but it was no longer threatening. The confrontation, terrifying as it had been, had reached a turning point. He returned to the house, exhausted but relieved. He knew that the events were not fully over, that the lessons he had faced tonight would continue to echo in his life. But he also understood that facing the past, acknowledging the wrong, and confronting the fear directly had shifted something fundamental. That night, as he lay in bed, he felt a quiet sense of peace he had not experienced in years. The shadows outside remained, but they no longer held the same weight. He understood now that the fear, the shadow, and the unease had been tied not only to the mysterious presence on his land, but to the unresolved parts of himself. By facing them, he had begun to reclaim his sense of control, his connection to the ranch, and the clarity of his own conscience. As sleep finally claimed him, he felt the wind outside, soft and gentle, carrying the scent of the fields. The ranch remained quiet, the night still, and for the first time in days he felt as though he could breathe freely, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. The morning after the terrifying confrontation, the rancher woke with a deep sense of quiet he had not felt in days. The first rays of sunlight slipped over the hills, painting the fields gold. The air was fresh, crisp, and carried the familiar scent of grass and earth, yet it felt different, lighter, calmer. For the first time in weeks, the rancher allowed himself to breathe deeply without the weight of fear pressing on his chest. He dressed slowly, pulling on his boots and stepping outside. The cattle grazed calmly in the pastures, and the birds sang softly from the trees. The familiar rhythm of the ranch was still there, but something had shifted. The tension, the sense of being watched, the shadows that had made every step uneasy, none of it pressed on him as it had before. It was as though the land itself had exhaled along with him. As he moved through his morning chores, he noticed small changes that brought a sense of reassurance. The barn doors stayed securely in place. The tools remained exactly where he had left them. Even the tracks that had haunted him for days seemed to vanish with the morning dew. The world was returning to normal, or at least to a version of normal he could recognize. Yet, the rancher knew that the events of the past nights had not been a simple trick of the mind. He remembered clearly the shadow, the strange movements, the silent weight that had pressed down on him. It had been real, or at least it had been real to him, and it had forced him to face something he had long ignored, the mistakes he had made and the guilt he had carried in silence. As he worked, he reflected on that memory from years ago, the time he had tried to help a neighbor and accidentally made the situation worse. The guilt he had buried had quietly influenced his life ever since. The shadow, the strange disturbances, and even the woman's cryptic words were now clear to him. They were not random. They were a call to face the truth he had hidden, a test of his courage and honesty. By midday, he decided to take a long ride across the property, wanting to feel the land fully, to remind himself of the life he had built here. The horse moved steadily beneath him, hooves sinking slightly into the soft dirt of the trails. The ranch stretched out in every direction, familiar yet serene, the pastures golden under the sun. He rode slowly, letting the rhythm of the horse and the openness of the land calm his mind. As he approached the northern fence, the rancher paused. The tracks that had troubled him before were gone, replaced only by the soft imprint of his horse's hooves. The air felt lighter, the shadows less threatening. He felt a strange sense of gratitude, not just for the peace, but for the lesson. The terrifying events had forced him to confront a truth he could no longer ignore. A weight he had carried alone for years had been acknowledged, and in that acknowledgement, he found release. Returning to the barn, he spent time organizing his tools and checking the fences. Every movement was deliberate, careful, yet infused with a calm he had not experienced in a long time. Even the animals seemed aware of the change. The cattle grazed quietly, the horses stood calmly, and the barn felt alive with the ordinary rhythm of daily life. For the first time in weeks, he felt connected, fully, to the ranch and everything it held. The afternoon passed with the usual chores, but the rancher noticed small details that felt almost like reminders that the strange events had changed him. A bird perched unusually close, watching him with bright eyes. The wind carried a soft, almost musical rustle through the trees. Even the sunlight seemed richer, warmer, as if affirming that the calm was genuine, not a temporary reprieve. As evening fell, he stood on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the hills. The sky was painted with shades of pink and orange, reflecting across the fields. The cattle were settling in the pastures and the horses returned to the barn. He breathed deeply, feeling the cool air fill his lungs. The ranch had returned to a familiar peace, but he understood that nothing would be quite the same again. He had been changed, and in that change there was strength. That night, as he prepared for bed, he reflected further. The shadow, the cryptic words, and the unsettling events had all been terrifying, yes, but they had also been necessary. They had forced him to confront a part of himself he had avoided. He realized that the fear had been real, but it had also been a guide, a way to make him face what he needed to face to move forward. He thought of the woman who had visited days ago, and her words echoed clearly. "Your hands, that was wrong." At first, they had confused and unsettled him, but now he understood. They were not a judgment, but a mirror, a reflection of a mistake he had long buried. By facing that truth, he had taken the first step toward peace, toward accepting himself fully, flaws and all. The night passed quietly, without the restless movements and strange sounds of previous nights. The rancher slept deeply, without dreams of shadows or unseen presences. When he woke in the morning, the world was calm and bright, and he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The land, the animals, and even the smallest details of the ranch, the creak of a gate, the soft rustle of the grass, the distant call of a hawk, reminded him that life continued, steady and persistent. Over the next few days, he resumed his routines with a new energy. Fences were repaired carefully, pastures were checked thoroughly, and the animals were tended with a gentle attentiveness. Yet within this ordinary rhythm, he carried an extraordinary awareness. He had faced fear and guilt head-on, and in doing so had found clarity and courage he had not known he possessed. One evening, as he watched the sunset from the porch, he thought back to the terrifying nights and the shadow that had haunted him. He realized that the presence had not been an enemy, but a teacher. It had forced him to confront the past, to acknowledge mistakes, and to embrace the responsibility of his actions. The terror he had felt was only part of the lesson. The other part was acceptance, honesty, and the courage to face the consequences of his own life. The rancher now understood that fear and guilt, while heavy, could guide a person toward growth and understanding. He felt gratitude for the experience, strange though it seemed. The ranch remained his responsibility, his sanctuary, and his connection to the past, yet it was also a place of learning, a place where the challenges of life could teach patience, humility, and courage. Night after night he slept peacefully, the land calm and quiet under the moonlight. The shadows no longer carried menace, but merely the natural shapes of trees and hills. The tracks, once mysterious and troubling, faded with time, leaving only the memory of lessons learned and the awareness of growth. The rancher felt stronger, steadier, and more connected, to the land, to the animals, and to himself. As weeks passed, he often returned to the edge of the northern pasture, the place where the shadow had appeared. He would pause, letting the wind move through his hair, listening to the soft rustle of the trees. The memory of fear and guilt was still there, but it no longer controlled him. Instead, it reminded him of the strength he had found and the courage it took to face the unknown. One quiet evening, he sat by the fence with his hands resting on the wooden rails, weathered but strong. The sun was setting, painting the sky in gentle hues. He watched as the cattle grazed peacefully, the horses settled in the barn, and the wind moved softly through the fields. The ranch, once a place of solitude and unease, now felt fully alive and welcoming. The rancher smiled faintly, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. He knew that life would continue to bring challenges, storms, accidents, and moments of doubt. But he also knew that he had faced something far greater than any of those. He had faced the shadows of the past, the mistakes he had carried, and the fear that had haunted him. And in facing them, he had reclaimed peace, strength, and a renewed connection to the world around him. As night fell and the stars appeared in the sky, he felt a profound sense of calm. The land stretched endlessly around him, quiet and still, holding the promise of new days and steady work. He knew he was not alone. He had the memories, the lessons, and the knowledge that he had endured and grown. The ranch, the animals, and the land itself seemed to embrace him, reminding him that even after fear and uncertainty, life continued, beautiful and enduring. And so, the rancher continued his life with renewed purpose, aware of the past but no longer burdened by it. The events that had once terrified him had transformed into wisdom and resilience. The ranch remained his sanctuary, the animals his companions, and the land a teacher in its own quiet, enduring way. The lessons of fear, guilt, and courage remained with him, but now they were guides, not burdens, helping him face each day with calm strength and quiet confidence. He settled in for the night, lantern dim, windows closed, and the air still. The land slept peacefully, the stars watched silently from above, and the rancher finally felt the sense of peace he had been seeking for so long. The shadows of the past had been faced, the terror confronted, and the life he loved was restored. The rancher knew that whatever came next, he had the strength, clarity, and courage to meet it.